Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. The 2024 US presidential election is truly awful. On the one hand, a far-right billionaire, former president, whose supporters have taken control of the Republican Party away from the conservatives whose party it once was. On the other, the outgoing Democrat vice president who champions the US capitalist status quo and merges the defense of liberal civil and political rights against the far right's threat with support for strengthening US imperialism in its rivalry with China, continuing to enable Israel's war on Palestinians and now in Lebanon, and so on. So how did the USA, which is still the most powerful society in global capitalism, come to be in this situation? To discuss this, I'm joined on Victor's Children by Aaron Amaral. Could you introduce yourself?
Happy to. Hi, David. I'm very glad to be here. I think what you're doing with the podcast is really important contribution to the left and the socialist movement. Just to say a few things about myself, I'm a longtime socialist based in New York City. My radicalization and activism dates from the mid-1980s and includes a lot of international solidarity and anti-imperialist organizing. Professionally, I work as a labor attorney with municipal unions here in the city. And my primary political work these days is as a member of the Tempest Collective, a small but I think vibrant revolutionary socialist organizing project in North America. I'm also one of the editors of Tempest Mag website and on the editorial board of New Politics, which I imagine many of your listeners know is a pretty well-established journal of socialism from below politics.
Okay, thanks. So, unlike the other long-standing capitalist democracies, the United States has a political system which is really dominated by two parties, only two. And those parties are also not organized in the same way that would be familiar to, for example, listeners in Canada or the UK and many other places. In many places, we're familiar with parties that actually have memberships and local chapters or branches and so on. So can you take us back in US history, for the sake of those of us who don't really know that history, to explain how this two-party system came to be?
Sure. I think there are kind of multiple intertwined histories that have to be disentangled to answer the question. And I do think it's important to some extent to think about the different strands as distinct. First is the history of the US Constitution itself, which structures the sort of republic, which is both a product of both a compromise of the various ruling class factions in the colonial period, and an explicit effort to do a few things depending on the colony to maintain minority rule, to protect the institutions of slavery, and to facilitate the growth of what was then in the late 18th century a nascent financial and industrial emergent capitalist class. The second history is the history of the development of U.S. settler colonial capitalism and the disputes within sections of the ruling elites and the development of party politics that accompanied each period in that development. So party organizations have been driven in the first instance by the strategic debates and perspectives of different fractions of the U.S. ruling class historically. And we can talk a little bit about it. I think there's sort of different political scientists talk about different periods of party politics in the United States. The third strand is the history of popular struggles for democracy in the context of the first two. And this has forced open intermittently the question of democratic rights, the overthrow of slavery, the act of voting rights, and raised critical issues of reform depending on the kind of historical moment that often will then be adapted by the various party formations as necessary components of their coalitions or part of their platforms. Just a few things on each, I think. With regards to the U.S. Constitution, it's important to understand the structure of the U.S. Republic is premised from the beginning on limiting the franchise. Only propertied men, based on the decisions of the various states a slave owner, disproportionate slave owner representation based on what's known as a 3/5 compromise. The idea that because the southern slave states were less populated by white property owning Protestant men, the slaves would be counted as 3/5 a person to give additional representation to those slave owners. A bicameral government. So instead of a unicameral parliament, there's a higher chamber of the Senate, which in its initial iteration was not directly elected. So to further insulate it from direct democratic control, the co-equal branch of an independent executive that's also insulated from democratic control, that to this day is elected not directly but through a electoral college tied to the states, and a judiciary. And this is interesting to me as a labor lawyer and a Marxist, that has historically claimed for itself the right to broad-based judicial oversight of the Constitution. Marbury versus Madison is the famous case. But the idea of this sort of Supreme Court standing over everything, also an undemocratic institution, which has had profound impacts in the Trump period, which maybe we could talk about. On the second thing, just to say a little bit, I mentioned the sort of party systems and the questions of ruling class representation in the party systems. We probably don't want to spend too much time talking about the history, although it's fascinating. The first party system goes back to the immediate period after the revolution, is really a kind of struggle about what the kind of nascent republic would look like. The question of the relative power of bankers versus small landowners, the questions of state rights, the response to the French Revolution, the question of the extent to which there's going to be an integrated national security establishment. The second party system sort of starts in the aftermath of the failed attempt to expand through the War of 1812, the invasion of Canada, and really marks a kind of particular moment of an expansion of settler colonialism into the West and parts of the southern parts of the United States, driven by a real populist effort that expands the voting base, but on a real pretty explicitly racist and expansionist basis. So sort of the Democrats in the South, where they kind of created a kind of base among slave owners and a white population in the South, and Northern Whigs at that time, connected to Northern factory interests largely. In the lead up to this, importantly, in the lead up to the Civil War, there's a really important evolution, that led to the creation of the Republican Party, led to Abraham Lincoln being elected president, on the basis of a new coalition, the Republicans, that brought together explicitly anti-slavery forces with so-called free soil, complicated history of northern nascent working class and small farmers who are opposed to slavery but also looking for expansion. After the failure of Reconstruction, there's a third period, which is really about the expansion of industrial capitalism, where the Republican Party, because of the credibility after the Civil War, sort of maintains power, not so much anymore as the power as a party of that overthrew slavery, but really the party of an expansive industrial capitalism and free market, that simultaneously oversaw, in a kind of not quite sure what the word is, in a partnership with a slaveocracy in the South, kind of maintain the two-party system through the late 19th century and early 20th century, and then through much of the 20th century, particularly after the Great Depression, the growth of the workers' movement, a new coalition of a new Democratic Party, which brought together still that class base in the South, which is pretty reactionary, based on the kind of Jim Crow white South, and a growing base of a new municipal party political machine, Democratic Party, that was tied to immigrant communities, and ultimately that brought in the Popular Front period, which maybe we'll talk about, the exploding labor movement. And then I guess we can talk, the period of the post-war, post-Second World War period of relative stability and unprecedented economic growth saw a very stable two-party system, both very, committed to U.S. imperialism for the first time as a kind of world hegemon, and a Republican Party that at that moment still represented the biggest the sections of big capital, and throughout the period from the post-war 46 to really the Nixon election in the early 70s, sort of represented a sort of stable capitalist party. The period from Nixon, I think, even through Trump, represents something really important, which we could talk about. But the Nixon breaks the Democratic stranglehold on the white slaveocracy, the Jim Crow South, and there's an important political realignment, so that the Republican Party through the Nixon and Reagan era increasingly start to represent the kind of reactionary forces of U.S. racism historically, and located mainly in the South, but not exclusively, along with a party politics very committed to the expansion of U.S. empire and the national security state, along with its well-established ties to finance capital. And the Democratic coalition starts to change. So that's the potted history of the kind of party politics. I'm going to save on the third issue of the kind of popular movements. I think we can. I'll save that as we talk about some of the other history, because I think the question of the possible breaks from the two-party system is intimately tied to the questions of popular movements historically for democratic rights at different moments.
That's very helpful. Thanks. So before we need to move to the 21st century, but before we get to the 21st century, I do want to just ask if you could say a little bit about the most important times when in the 20th century, when the two-party system has been really seriously challenged, and how those challenges were defeated.
Yeah. I mean, I think the two most important were in the late 19th century, the populist movement, and then in the early 20th century into the 1930s, the socialist and labor movement. Both are kind of reckoning with the kind of ravages of the development of industrial capitalism. In the context of the populist movement in particular, you see a rise in the 1880s and 1890s, the rise of a kind of, in particular in the South, a movement of small farmers who are heavily indebted, who are not being benefited by the Democratic Party controlled, former slaveholders, Jim Crow, big landowners, and in a growing alliance with a sort of black small land sharecroppers and small farmers, along with a kind of the nascent labor party efforts in the North, the Knights of Labor. There's an effort to have an electoral expression to these important movements. There's very important struggles that take place, both with regards to the issues in the South and questions of debt and democratic rights, and also obviously in the North in terms of really important labor struggles in the context of, in particular, the expansions of the railway system. And there's a concerted effort to build an electoral expression to these popular movements that express themselves in the populist movement in the 1890s. It's pretty incredible to look back on it now. There were numerous elected officials in the populist movement across the South and the Midwest representing this democratic instinct. In the election of 1892, James Weaver took more than 1 million votes, won 5 states, 22 electoral college votes in this expression. this was largely defeated. There's a whole history here about the sort of challenges of the movement and the kind of downturn of its electoral expression that was essentially in a context to understand where the Democratic Party was largely in the post-Civil War period, largely kept out of the presidency and federal office. William Jennings Bryan was able to, on the kind of basis of the least common denominator expression of the populist movement, which was soft money, the idea of silver over gold, was able to win the Democratic Party nomination and really co-opt the movement. And it's in a complicated history, but really co-opt the populist movement so that it was incorporated essentially into the Democratic Party, and that was its downfall. The second most important, or probably maybe the most important possible kind of break is, and it's important to emphasize here that this is not in the first instance an electoral question. It's about what's important here is the developments of social power and social movements. So that in the early 19th century, with the rise of the labor movement and the development of a socialist movement, there are very important electoral breakthroughs by a nascent socialist party led by Eugene Debs. So in the early 1910s, there are victories at the municipal and state levels across the country, mainly in the Northeast and Midwest, by explicit socialists who politically represent a politics that was reflective of social democracy at that period more generally, which is, the left to right spectrum. So this is not all revolutionary socialist politics, but kind of reform-minded socialist would win power there, the so-called sewer socialists, the idea that they're going to sort of municipal reformers were going to take power as socialists and make things right. But they're really important, this is tied to both the labor movement, but also really significant movements for social reform, particularly in the urban landscape, which with the explosion of industrial, kind of free market industrial capitalism was a living nightmare if you look at that kind of history of that age. So Eugene Debs in prison because of his opposition to the First World War wins 1 million votes in 1920. And there was some interesting parallel. There was some discussion in the context of Trump potentially facing early this year when Trump was before the Supreme Court bailed him out. When Trump was facing the real possibility of prison time before the election, there were interesting discussions of the last candidate with any weight running from prison being Eugene V. Debs. The kind of most important moment of that continuum is in the 1930s. And with the growth, in particular after the Russian Revolution, of the left wing of the socialist movement and the importance of the Communist Party in particular in the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, and the growing labor movement, the building of this incredibly powerful labor movement. I'd encourage people, there's a really important, I think, sort of piece written by Charlie Post that I would encourage people to go and look at about the history of the Popular Front. And there was real possibilities at that time because of the sort of, not just the size of the Communist Party, which was not a mass party like in other parts of Western Europe, but still had, thousands, if not tens of thousands of cadre members. In the context of the kind of burgeoning labor movement at the time, there were real possibilities to both construct independent militant industrial unions like the CIO that would be independent of the Democratic Party and independent of the bosses. There were real important possibilities for multiracial unity and struggle explicitly around questions of race and racism. Possibilities of for this discussion, possibilities of independent working class electoral expressions. The creation of a labor party was very much on the agenda. And when you ask the question of why is the U.S. different than Canada or Western Europe, this experience and the failure to create a labor party in the 1930s is a really important moment to think about why there wasn't this third party breakthrough. And then, there was the opportunity to create a lasting minority revolutionary socialist current in the United States, rooted in the working class, rooted amongst the kind of vanguard of militant trade unionists and workers and community struggles that really did represent a mass current at that time in the 1930s into the 1940s. And to have had that expression politically of revolutionary socialist politics within that movement would have been an incredibly important breakthrough. Unfortunately, and again, this is a little bit of a potted history, but the Communist Party, part of the answer here is that the Communist Party was answerable to Soviet foreign policy and the turn to a popular front politics, which which in the interest of Soviet policy and trying to build alliances with the Roosevelt administration in particular, was seeking alliances with the Democratic Party and made an argument that we could build socialism through an alliance with sections of the capitalist class. Arguments which had really not been articulated ever before in that way in the socialist movement. But what it meant in practice in the United States context, the Popular Front, was that instead of a priority on building an independent labor party, instead of a priority on building an independent class expression in the labor movement, et cetera, it became much more about building coalitions with the Democratic Party and the Roosevelt administration. Obviously, this is a more complicated history, but this was an incredibly important moment for people to look at. I think there are, in thinking about the question, there are other moments of potential sort of third party electoral breakthroughs. If you think about the global justice movement in 1999 and 2000 and the Nader campaign that came then, or if you think about the efforts in the late 1960s, the Peace and Freedom Party as an expression of the anti-war movement and the Black freedom struggle, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is another kind of moment. These, I think, were kind of qualitatively different than the first two I mentioned, just because they were not as kind of intimately tied to kind of deeply rooted organized social expressions in the same way. Maybe that's a controversial position, but there were certainly other possible opportunities for third-party electoral breaks from the Democratic Party. And we could also talk about the kind of Bernie Sanders, the kind of post-2008, 2008 economic crisis, and the left's illusions in the Sanders moment as offering a possible route to a third-party break from the Democratic Party, which of course has failed to materialize, and I think some of us always argued was never on the cards with that campaign. But I think the kind of the two most important are the earlier ones I mentioned.
Yes, and listeners will find a link in the show notes to Charlie Post's article on the Popular Front if you're interested in following up. So for a long time, both the Republicans and the Democrats were parties of the U.S. capitalist class, which for listeners in Canada or Britain, it's a bit like the way that you have the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party in those societies. But they were drawing their leaderships and their voter support from different parts of social classes and from somewhat different regions within the U.S. Can you just very briefly say something about that, what the situation looked like before the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, so just at the beginning of the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, so there's an important distinction, I think, from the kind of the Democratic Party coalition that was built out of the Roosevelt administration, out of the Popular Front in the post-war period, in a period of massive economic growth, which was based on, continued to be based on the kind of longstanding, centuries-old, Democratic Party Southern stronghold of kind of big landowners and a kind of racist leadership, along with kind of important sections of the northern municipal political machines that were able to, through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, offer very important reforms, and including the context of the civil rights movement, really important civil rights legislation in the face of kind of the mass civil rights movement. There's a difference between that expression of the Democratic Party and what evolves in the neoliberal period in the early 21st century, where after the kind of explosions of the late 1960s and early 1970s, Nixon comes to power, really articulating a kind of, winning a kind of new electoral coalition that starts to win the Southern Democratic base over to the Republican Party, as I mentioned earlier, and the context for reforms to the municipal party machine, Democratic Party machines, and the constituent parts in the labor movement and the Black movement weaken. And what you see, starting with Bill Clinton, but all through the period of Barack Obama, I know I'm going past 2008, is a kind of consolidation of a kind of new leadership and a new coalition of the Democratic Party in the face of the Republican Party, which is something we saw throughout Western capitalism, which is the kind of movement of the historic center-left reformist parties moving very explicitly to the right and the center-right in the context of the kind of growth and the stabilization of capitalism in the neoliberal period. So the Clinton administration, the Clintons campaign was very explicitly directed at breaking from the promises of the post-war historic Democratic Party coalition, and was much more business friendly. Hillary Clinton, who then later ran in 2016, expressed this as the Democrats running as Eisenhower Republicans. That she explicitly talked about the Democrats, essentially adopting the kind of the politics of what had been in the mid 20th century, the Team A for U.S. capitalism. So at the period of in the neoliberal period, there's a kind of continuing weakening of the popular base within the Democratic Party, a turn towards closer ties to kind of growing new sections of capital in information and technology, and an effort on both parties' part to kind of outdo themselves as the strongest party of national defense, the arms industry, national security, border security, et cetera. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but really, you kind of in the kind of early 21st century, you see both parties sort of moving to the right. The expression of the Nader campaign in 2000 is really kind of representative of a kind of exhaustion of the movements of the left with that move. This is how you get Bill Clinton. This is how you get George W. Bush, and the kind of subsequent disastrous invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, with the essentially the quiescence and complicity of the Democratic Party, large measure.
And then you have 2008, 2009, the so-called Great Recession, bringing to an end the long period of capitalist expansion. We could say the neoliberal era from the early 80s on. There's a turning point in terms of capitalism entering into a new period of, where capital is encountering real difficulties to having sustained accumulation and higher rates of profit, the period that we're still in. So if you focus on the Republican Party, what has happened to the Republican Party since the Great Recession? How did it come to be taken over? This, I think, is something that's not appreciated enough by a lot of people, how it's changed, and it's been taken over now, I would argue, by far-right forces that, in fact, are really out of alignment with where most of the U.S. capitalist class is at. even the segments of the ruling class that used to be aligned with the Republican Party. So can you talk about that and how those far-right forces got to be so strong in the last 15 years?
Yeah, I think there's a story to be told here generally about not just in the US at all. Again, I think there's something important happening internationally in the advanced capitalist countries in the kind of late neoliberal period, at a period when the kind of 2007, 2008 is obviously the moment of profound crisis of the kind of neoliberal expansion, that the historic parties we're no longer able to kind of meet the challenge of the crisis, and so there was both in the context of the Republican Party. First of all, I think it's important to talk about the extreme social crisis that arises post 2007, 2008. There's a sort of unprecedented drop in life expectancy in the U.S. I mean, this is the question of U.S. exceptionalism and the expectation of that the kind of the experience of the 1950s and 1960s was kind of normalized as a kind of permanent state of ever upwards, ever onwards. So the kind of the next generation is always going to be in a better social and economic position than its parents. This expectation was brutally destroyed in the 2007-2008 period. So if you look at the window between 2008 and, for example, 2020, you see incredible statistics that speak to a real social crisis that's at play. Unprecedented drops in life expectancy that we hadn't seen in this country since the Great Depression. Even if you start looking at the indigenous communities and Hispanic and Black communities, it's significant. But even in the white communities, there are significant drops in the relatively privileged material positions of whites historically. Incredible increases in suicide rates, especially for younger workers. Incredible explosions of drug use and drug overdose deaths. Just sort of kind of symptoms of the broader social crisis. Radical shrinking of wages and wage growth, and in particular for a younger generation, a sense of being unmoored, and for sections of in this context, what we see is an explosion of social struggle, both the beginning of renewed labor militancy, in going back to the struggles in Wisconsin over labor rights. If you think about Occupy Wall Street, and the questions of, in a kind of nascent way, raising class politics, the problems of the 1%. You think about the explosion of anti-racist struggle, culminating in the George Floyd uprising. Incredible levels of social explosion that we hadn't seen in this country since the 1960s. And that took expression electorally with the Bernie Sanders campaign. It also took some expression earlier with the election of Barack Obama as the first Black president, although he himself really represented continuity. He was a member of the Democratic Leadership Conference. His politics were very much in line with kind of the neoliberal Democratic Party turn. In the broad, Democratic Party constituency, there was this kind of idea, kind of wrong idea, but an idea that the kind of Obama election was going to bring some real change, which did not happen. And he successfully navigated in capital's interests with his election in 2008, the kind of worst of the crisis. But really on the backs of the working class and oppressed communities. The failure I think what we see with the Republican Party, and the turn to kind of an extreme kind of right-wing populism, and I'll say something more explicitly about the capitalist base or who the base is of the Trump coalition. But what you see with the change in the Republican Party is really a response to that to those social explosions, and also a response, importantly, I think, to the failures of what was seen by that movement as the failure to properly respond to the crisis of U.S. empire. So it's not coincidental Trump's focus on China as the problem, Trump's criticisms historically of the neoconservative wars in George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq speak to a really deep-seated nativism
what people call isolationism.
Isolationism is the word I'm thinking of. Sorry. Maybe you can edit that. But and so, Trump is able to speak to a historic, an always existing, electorate that includes a very right-wing, social conservative base that has its roots, going back to the Southern white ruling classes in the South, but also importantly to a heavily dislocated petty bourgeoisie middle class that was similarly impacted by the social crisis post 2007, 2008, but was politically, in opposition to the social struggles and the social movements, in opposition to the election of Obama, reacting to the idea of a black president, reacting to the idea of a possibility of a woman president in the 2016 election, heavily opposed to the racial justice struggles in 2020. When people talk about, so Trump is able to reconstruct the Republican Party coalition by kind of writing out sections of the kind of neoconservative wing of historically the Republican Party, based on what were widely seen correctly as, I think, in different ways from the left, but the experience of the George W. Bush administration and the gross expenditure of tens of billions of dollars in the military engagements in Southwest Asia, and recreate a kind of coalition based on these other sections that have been impacted by the 2008 crisis, always existing kind of a reactionary base of white middle class people, a kind of growing base, and I want to say a little bit about this of particular kind of far right characters in the billionaire class, millionaire and billionaire class, that really provide a kind of material base of support for Trump. If you look at his biggest supporters, and this sections of the petty bourgeoisie, essentially small business owners, who were heavily hurt by the 2007, 2008 crisis, and who look at, who are ready to be won to the politics of national chauvinism, of racism, of immigrant bashing, of the bashing of women and trans folks. If the people talk, and I think it's important. I did some rough math. The people talk about the kind of the Republican Party as newly as a party of the white working class, and I think it misses. I think it's wrong, really. Historically, first of all, the kind of when the pundits talk about the working class, what they're really talking about are the numbers of white, self-identified white voters who are not college educated. So this is not, as Marxists would understand, the definition of working class as people who have to sell their labor power. This is the definition of people who are not college educated. So point one is that even by that definition, the number of so-called white working class voters that Trump win is at the high end, 59%, I think, in 2020, 2016, I can't remember, which is comparable to what Reagan won in 1980 and 84. But if you actually look at the numbers, depending on whether whether associate degrees count or not, 41 to 47% of per the 2020 census in the U.S. Between 41 and 47% of all white business owners in this country are without college degrees. So the idea that when they're talking about the white working class, so-called, what they're really talking about is a huge base of the white petty bourgeoisie. It's just another way to make that point. And so, this is the historic base of reaction, not just in the United States, but historically. I don't know. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I just throw in this for people who may not be aware of it. There's, of course, mass abstention, right? This also has to be considered whenever we talk about who votes in the U.S., just because we've seen falling rates of participation in elections across the world. But certainly in the U.S., there's been a trend. It's pretty.
Yeah,
pretty
that's an incredibly important point. I don't have the statistics at hand, but the electoral system, the kind of as a whole, is incredibly alienating to people, and the levels of participation are very small compared to other advanced capitalist countries. So the kind of the two-party electoral circus, as important as the outcome is in some ways, is really understood and seen as an expression of the lack of social power for large sections of the electorate, implicitly or explicitly.
Yeah, before we move on to talk about Kamala Harris and the Democrats, are there any other last things you'd like to say about the Republicans in terms of the social forces that are organized under the Republican Party or their political program?
I mean, the Project 2025 thing is not a joke, and people should go and look at what it represents. I mean, I think Trump and Sam Farber's sort of written about Trump, and I think there's something really insightful about Sam's characterization of Trump as a lumpen capitalist. Trump really historically, going back to his father, who is a renowned racist, by the way, was arrested in a Klan rally in Queens, New York, in the I think in the 20s or 30s, has historic ties to kind of shady business practices and sort of all kinds of criminality, in the real estate world, and ties to sections of capital and finance capital which have supported that. But he himself politically, I think, is more of a unique, opportunistic character. But he's found a path to political power on the basis of a kind of most kind of reactionary political program. And so I do think it's worth talking about the kind of the threat to the immigrant community, the sort of explicit appeals to racism, the explicit appeals to democratic rights, abortion, trans rights, and that the forces that back him are a coalition that include explicitly fascist organizations, that include explicitly street fighting forces that we recognize as fascist, that showed their faces in the January 6th uprising, but also include a coalition of not just historic evangelical movement we've known for a long time, but kind of newly growing right-wing Catholic movement that includes J.D. Vance, that includes important people in the Supreme Court, with the most backwards ideas about women's rights and family rights, so-called family values. So I think it's a coalition that includes all of the kind of the nastiest elements in the U.S. polity and U.S. society, and some that have really deep roots in U.S. history that speak to its history as a kind of settler colonial enslaved project. And I think having that history in mind is important.
So let's talk about the Democrats just a bit. Can you say something about how you analyze the social forces that are leading the Democratic Party and the program around which they are united? And maybe also a little bit about who really controls that party and why efforts by people on the left to take over the party or push it to the left have done so poorly.
I mean, I think this was sort of intimated in one of your earlier questions, or should have been. I should have said something about this earlier. But the party system as a whole whether you're talking about the Democrats or Republicans, are unique in some ways because we're not talking about membership organizations. These are not parties that you can join and get a membership card and a right to vote, kind of to select, platforms and leaders. They're organizations that are very much controlled by the funders of the organizations, and then the constituent parts that rely on those funders. And in particular, in the kind of neoliberal era, and with the kind of there's certain very important court cases that allowed for the massive expansion of funding into the electoral system by corporations and untraceable donors, essentially. Even comparatively, the party's structures are more greatly controlled by the base of funders than before. If you look at, it's interesting, if you look at maybe you can also include a link. There's a site called Open Secrets that tracks some of the funding for the various campaigns. If you look at the kind of the biggest fund donors to each of the organizations, each of the campaigns, and again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign donations. What you see when you look at the Trump campaign, Trump backers are, essentially groups of billionaires who have their own foundations, who often come out of domestic manufacturing, who have longstanding ties to, far-right circles. And then you get sort of further down the line, energy interests and sections of finance capital. If you look at the Democratic Party, if you look at Kamala Harris, the funders that can be traced anyways, and again, there's lots that can't be, include much more prominently sections of finance capital. And we know from some of the PACs, or you can deduce from some of the PACs, sections of high tech and media capital. Important to note that Kamala Harris comes out of the Bay Area, and the Democratic Party machine there, and particularly in recent years, has been very tied to Silicon Valley. So while Trump had some very important funders, individual backers like Elon Musk, among others, there's some others.
Peter Thiel.
Yeah, Peter Thiel. Harris also has lots of money coming in from Silicon Valley and from Hollywood. And then you get important contributions from organized labor tied to, in particular, the trades donating to PACs in the millions of dollars. So the coalition that they're trying to build electorally to vote for Harris as the Democratic Party nominee is not necessarily consonant with the backers that essentially control the candidacy. I mean, it's notable. I mean, there's a number of things that's fascinating about this electoral cycle. The fact that how readily the Democratic Party was able to make Harris the nominee without any democratic process. She was essentially pronounced as the successor when Biden stepped down. That's a sort of living example of how the Democratic Party functions. There was no need. It's not a membership organization. There was no need for a vote. There wasn't even a need for a straw vote. The political leadership, in consultation with the financial backers, got together and decided what was going to be the best path for this campaign, and the Kamala Harris campaign was announced and born. Sorry, I think I'm losing the thread a little bit, but
no, that's fine. You want to say something briefly about the program, like what they're actually running on? And
yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that how much the party has really become in the context of the post 2007 2008 crisis and the transformation of the Republican Party. How much the Democratic Party, and I should say the exhaustion of the social movements, the exhaustion of the electoral efforts of the left, and the co-optation of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. There's a really important article on that, parenthetically, by Haley Pessin that we ran in Tempest a few years back, that I think speaks to the way in which the Democratic Party was able to co-opt and neuter the 2020 movement. And there's a long history of this. But in the context of the Republican Party transformation, the exhaustion of the kind of social movements in the left, and their co-optation, the Democratic Party under Harris and Biden have really become the team A of capitalism, have become the team of capitalist stability, of national security stability, of imperial stability, and that's manifest in all kinds of ways. If you think about on the policy level, the adoption of frightening immigration policies in conjunction with some of the most right-wing leaders of the Republican Party in the Senate. I mean, this border bill represents a frightening escalation of attacks on migrants. The kind of rallying around Harris of some of the most odious figures of neoconservatism, backers of imperial war and expansion, obviously most prominently Dick Cheney, but not exclusively. There's a whole wing of what had previously been one of the bulwarks of the Republican coalition, who are now backing Harris on this basis. There are these gestures that they make towards social issues, but if you scratch the surface, you find that like with abortion, where there's understandable extreme disgust and anger and concern about the loss of abortion rights, the reality is that not only was the Democratic Party historically complicit in the loss of those rights, Joe Biden, this always gets on is one of my hobby horses, but was an important vote to put Clarence Thomas back on the bench back in whenever that was, in the early 90s, I think.
On the Supreme Court.
On the Supreme Court, yeah, sorry. The Democratic Party has played a role in conceding on this issue over many decades. Even in the aftermath of the overturning of Roe, there were things that the Democratic Party could have done to go on the offensive with regards to the abortion issue, which they've just failed to do. And so they shouldn't be seen as reliable allies even on this issue. But really, in this moment, Harris has been kind of unleashed, happy to throw around her bona fides as a gun-carrying prosecutor who, knows how to protect us from the criminals and bad people. On a policy level, what we're seeing between these candidates is really a fight between the most kind of reactionary far-right kind of candidate in Trump with the backing of actual fascist forces, with a candidate of the center and center-right standing for continuity and capitalist stability in a context of growing instability and threats to empire. Ashley Smith's done some really important writings on this with regards to the Biden policy agenda, which we should expect. We have no reason to doubt that Harris, in this way, will continue. He's termed it imperial Keynesianism, but a real effort to kind of build a kind of manufacturing base in the U.S. to expand the kind of national security apparatus and the defense capacity to compete with China and to maintain U.S. imperial hegemony in the new period of a kind of asymmetrical inter-imperial rivalries. This is not about a progressive agenda for the working class in any way. And so it's a very depressing moment. And if you think about that, then I think this context becomes important in thinking about how the left should be approaching these elections. There's an incredible, understandable fear and anxiety, both about the moment overall, about the state of the world, about the state of society, and also the real threat represented by Trump and his movement. Cannot deny that. We have to understand, though, what allowed him to come to power. Our own failures to consolidate and advance in the last period, and the way in which the Democratic Party, as the party of the establishment and the status quo, is a very easy target for the far right in the absence of a left, in the absence of another alternative, to be seen as the counterpower, as to be seen as something different. And there's a real appeal to that, however manifestly crazy and fucked up, and criminal Donald Trump is. They're tapping into a very real sense of like, why would we want to support Democratic Party when we see what they represent as a party of elites and the establishment in a context in which we are suffering? And if the left is not part of that equation, is not an alternative, or we don't start to build one, then this dialectic is just going to get worse. And so for the Tempest perspective, we're not interested. We understand people's anxieties. We're not interested in what individuals are going to do or telling people what they should do in minute in the ballot box. But we are insisting that if the left is going to be able to build a different social pole, rebuild the structures of independent institutions of the working class and within the oppressed communities that are not so readily co-opted, that are not dependent on the Democratic Party, that can act as a real opposition, then we can't be spending our energies and efforts and resources on supporting the party of capitalist stability and imperialist, expansion and, in the context of Palestine, ongoing genocide.
I think that's a great place to end. Thanks very much, Aaron.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.